We've already gone through a lot of the common HTML elements that are used within web design today. So now let's look at how we can structure our web page in order to actually present it as an actual web page. So the use of divs and spans is commonly used to be able to provide that structure for our HTML pages. So we do divs and spans, and we can have multiple divs and content within those divs. So if I did something like this and closing off that one, and maybe we had not closing off one, but closing off the div, and I had another div here, and I did two, and I closed off that div, and now I've got one outstanding div to close off. And we can see here that we can start building out this type of structure here. So if you really look at this, if I tidy this up, it starts to look a little bit like a list. And this is where CSS would come into play, and that if we had a div within inside of a div, maybe we could indent it or we could structure it slightly differently. And we see that divs by default, so I'm going to just add in a background or a background color and give it a background color of blue. And we see that these divs by default, they take up that whole available space. So what happens if, like what we had looked at before, we've got some content here and we wanted to highlight this, and then we had some more blah 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 content there, and this one we had a bunch of blah blah blah, but we want to highlight something somewhere over here. So it doesn't really allocate us, because divs, if we place a element around the highlight, if we place a div around there, it's going to actually bring us to a new line. So let's just try that and I'll show you how this is going to work. So if I was to place a div around the highlight, let's see what happens now. So it's not going to really work as nicely and neatly as we want it to. See there, it's dropped it down to the new line, and get rid of this horrible red here. Or maybe just delete that. And we can see that it doesn't really work as neatly because divs already have built-in styling into it. And this is where we would use something like spans. And spans gives us the ability to do these inline attributes into our elements without actually disrupting the flow of the content. So let me get rid of this. And now instead of a div, I'm going to use CSS, and I'm going to do background color, and let's do yellow, so it really highlights it out. So we see that we do have the ability to use divs and spans in order to present our content, to structure our HTML in a way that's more presentable to our CSS. So this is part of the planning that we do when we build out websites, is we plan out how we want the CSS to be able to interact with our content and be able to display our content and how it's actually going to be displayed. So we can add in things like padding now around it. So this is just some typical CSS. You can see we've got some padding now around it, so it's slightly bigger. We can even go as far as adding in borders. So if I wanted to add in a border, let's say I wanted one pick solid black border around it, we can see our highlighted items now have a border. I can even get rid of this yellow and just keep that border and that highlight. So whatever I want, I can now start applying with the CSS. And it's already set up within our HTML. So this is something what we do with our planning, where we figure out what we're going to need to update in our CSS, and before we're even writing our CSS, we build that into our HTML structure, so that's a lot easier to present and to work with. There's one other thing when it comes to HTML elements that we do need to keep in mind, and that gives us the ability to actually add classes and IDs. So much like what we've been doing here before, where we've been calling over to specific elements within our page just by using the tag in our CSS, we also have the option to call it over by ID, and any element can have this set of attributes added to it. So we can add in an ID, we can add in a class, and so on. And the way that classes work is that we have the ability to add in multiple classes. So we can, when we're designing our HTML structure, if, for instance, I want to have a particular class for highlight, then I would set up a class of highlight, and I could reuse that over and over again. So it doesn't necessarily need to be in a span. If I had a div down here, and if I want to highlight the contents of my div, then all I would do is need to call it in using that class. So let's check this out and see how this works. And instead of span, we're going to use the class to ID it. So we can specify the elements that we're applying a class of highlight, which makes a lot more sense because we ultimately want to be able to reuse spans in multiple places within our website without actually having any styling applied to it. So mostly when you are designing your website, you're going to think of it as using classes in order to apply those specific pieces of styling to it. And if you want to apply it to a specific element, this is where we use ID in order to identify ID. So this is just done by a hash. And now I'm selecting that particular element, and let's just add a border around it. So border, one pick, solid black. So we're able to really see what element we're looking at, and I'm going to add some margins around it. So I'm going to add 20 pick margin around it so it really stands out. So this particular div with an ID of ID is going to have this styling applied to it. And this is how we can really identify all the different elements within our page, because commonly when you look at the source code, you're going to see that you just have a ton and ton of different divs, spans throughout your website. And this is how we identify those particular spans, by adding classes and identifying them by ID. And of course, with every element, you can also add in styling. So if I wanted to add styling into my particular element, I could do it within this type of format as well. So I could do a background color and do something like red. And you'll see that this automatically gets applied. But the disadvantage of doing it within the HTML code and applying style as an attribute as opposed to a style sheet is that now if I wanted to ever update this website, if I came back and if I had 10 or 100 web pages and I want to update the background color, then I'd have to go through all of that HTML code in order to find where I've applied a background color of red to a particular style, and this can become very tedious and hard to work with. So best way to do it is to use divs and spans and just simply use classes and IDs to really identify the elements that you want to apply styling to. And whenever you're designing your structure, always consider the fact that best practice is to use those classes and IDs in order to apply styling. And also the best practice is to keep your HTML and your styling separated as much as possible. And this was really the whole idea of why they brought in styling and CSS, in order to be able to separate out the logic of having that presentation layer of your HTML code and then also how it's being styled to separate that out. So try to separate it out whenever you're in the planning stages of your website. In the next lesson, we're going to look at some more common HTML tags that are being used now within HTML5 in order to better structure and present our website in order to build out websites in a more modern fashion. So that's coming up in the next lesson.